Over the past several seasons, we've told the stories of children who couldn't read and the families and teachers who tried to help them inside systems that weren't built to succeed. We listened to the pain, we traced the history, we followed the science, and one truth kept rising to the surface. This is not a mystery, and it's no longer a debate. Reading failure harms children first, but responsibility does not stop there. In Season 4 of My Child Can't Read, A Heartland Crisis, we widen the lens to examine the state of literacy in Kansas and across America. This season begins with harm, the lived reality of children and families, and follows it upward through classrooms, policy, and institutions. Because when the evidence is clear, when solutions are proven, neutrality disappears. This is a season about what happens next, about the difference between knowing what works and taking responsibility for it. Welcome to Season 4, The State of Literacy. In the last episode, we heard the story of the Downing Project, a community-funded literacy program that helped children finally learn to read. It worked, and then it was shut down. Which raises a deeper question. If solutions exist, why weren't teachers taught them in the first place? New teacher Neil Zoglmann described what he experienced in his own teacher preparation program.
All of these folks who are teaching these balanced literacy classes, they're now teaching the science of reading somehow, even though they've never been exposed, they've never taught with the science of reading. So even if their syllabuses look great, so on paper, when you get into these courses, you get the MSV continuum and you get predictive text and you get these things that are not good practices.
When preparation looks right on paper, but breaks down in practice, the consequences don't stay in universities. They show up in classrooms. When educators are credentialed without competence, the harm isn't surprising. It's predictable. The science was already known. For listeners just joining us, this isn't new. For decades, scientists at the National Institutes of Health studied how children learn to read. One of the leading voices in that work was Dr. Reid Lyon, who helped lead that research and later shape national policy.
By the early 90s, we had already developed a converging body of evidence. Many studies replicating each other, telling us how reading develops. We had very good information about the types of instruction that's most beneficial to them. So it's simple. If you're going to be teaching kids or training teachers, base it on what we know works. It's that simple.
The evidence has existed for decades. Not theories, not trends, evidence. Journalists like Emily Hanford from AMP Reports have helped bring this national story into public view, exposing the gap between what research shows and what classrooms practice. Teachers were never taught it. Most teachers were never taught the sound-to-letter code.
I graduated in 2023, and we did the Fontes and Pinnell, we did the leveled readers, we did the running records. I almost failed my practicum because I couldn't place my kid. It wasn't an evidence-based practice for identifying areas of weakness.
Retired Principal Dana Hensley explains the gaps this creates.
They really want their children to succeed, but they just don't have the tools to know how to put it into place. They don't know what to do Monday morning. They may understand the philosophy, but they don't know how to apply it.
Teachers care, teachers learn, but they were sent into classrooms without the tools they needed. Teachers were failed by their training. This isn't theoretical. The consequences of how teachers are prepared are already showing up in classrooms.
It's such a big deal that we're not training people to do this, because we're building frustrations into students and teachers when these kids aren't learning to read. Teachers try so hard. They're trying and they're trying and they're trying, and that conversation is hard sometimes because it's really hard to hear that you've been doing something wrong. But it's not their fault that they were prepared incorrectly, because we're not holding the systems that are designed to support them accountable.
Not because teachers don't care, not because students can't learn, but because the system that prepared them didn't. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Credentialing without competence. Teachers graduate with degrees, certifications, credentials, but not always competence. And when that happens, credentialing without competence creates downstream harm. When pre-service teachers are taught methods their professors have never implemented with real children, the outcome isn't surprising. It's built into the system. National context and teacher prep crisis. We've heard what the research says. We've heard from experts. We've seen what works. So the question becomes, if we've known this, why hasn't it reached every classroom? In early 2026, a coalition of national education groups, led by the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, made a startling proposal. Not for a new curriculum, not for another initiative, but for a $2.5 billion rebuild of how we prepare teachers in this country. This wasn't coming from a single district or even a single state. This was a national acknowledgement that something at the foundation of our education system isn't working. Because the truth is, we don't just have a reading crisis. We have a preparation crisis. Fewer people are entering the profession. Teachers are being asked to meet increasingly complex needs, and many are walking into classrooms without the tools to do it. And while this proposal is national, this is exactly what families and teachers here in Kansas have been living for years. This isn't a fringe idea. This is the system, acknowledging itself. So the question becomes, if we now know what works, why weren't teachers ever taught it in the first place? And when you start to ask that question, you begin to see a pattern. Not of failure, but of preparation, of what teachers were taught and what they weren't, and what happens when an entire system is built on that gap. Evidence is visible everywhere. And once that harm is set in motion, it doesn't stay contained. Psychology professor Amy Nolan shares her findings with incoming college freshmen.
If a student was proficient when they were in high school, I think I still see so much anxiety with, submitting a paper in APA format or submitting a paper in MLA format. And no matter what subject I'm teaching, I usually take the time to explain in my very first class meeting the importance of literacy, and I teach psychology. And we know that literacy skills need to be nourished, improve as they get older.
Outside schools and universities, other professionals like Literacy Services Manager at the Wichita Public Library's Savannah Ball sees the impact of this every day. And sometimes it shows up in the quietest ways.
I think that the things that we usually notice are that a child might say they don't like to read, or they might be drawn to books that are way below their normal reading level. A lot of times I'll see parents who come in by themselves picking out books for their kids, which usually means to us that they might have a reluctant reader. When we hear that, when we hear a kid saying, I don't like reading, I don't like books, it's usually a sign that maybe there is something else going on.
The evidence is visible, not in theory, in real children, in real time. proof that change works. And here's what makes this even harder to ignore. We don't just see the problem, we see what works. Hear what school director Tammy Hope says about their observations at Rolfe Literacy Academy.
So we have students, some of them come to us very young, but then if you're talking about a third grader, that would be kindergarten, first and second. So at least 3 years, some of them more than that if they were in a preschool that was introducing letters and letter names.
And then what changed once instruction shifted to structured literacy?
So the things that change, we like to tell our kids, you don't have to guess. You don't have to wonder what it is, because now with structured literacy, you have the tools to know exactly what those words are.
That changes everything.
Then they are able to decode words. They know when they don't know a word, which is equally important. They know whether or not they have to say, hey, I don't have the tools for this. Can you assist me? Instead of guessing. They know there's a way to get that information. And then when they start to see success, then they start to build confidence. They become bolder, and then they are willing to take risks. Is where we really see the growth. So when they start saying, I know I don't know this word, but I'm going to try to apply the tools that I already have, and then they nail it and they get it right because the tools work. And that's where we see students flying. So that's phenomenal. So now we have kids who are walking around the building carrying notebooks because they want to take notes, and they are asking if they can read on recess because now they have the tools that they need. And that's legitimate confidence.
And behind every data point, there's a child and a family. Parent Heather Mora saw what happened when instruction finally aligned.
I tell my best friend all the time that she literally changed the trajectory of their life because she's the one who connected me over there.
And what happened next changed everything.
They both are reading well above their level. My oldest, the teacher said that she never had a kiddo be able to read at his level whenever he finished. And because it was well above even high school level when they left RLA. So he would have been finishing 5th grade.
When instruction aligns with how the brain learns to read, children learn to read. This is the proof. Responsibility shift. There was a time when confusion made sense, but once the evidence exists, responsibility changes. And once we can see the pattern, the question is no longer what's happening, it's who is responsible. Researcher Tim Odegaard puts it this way.
What they can do is they can give them the clear knowledge they need to understand literacy. It takes more than that. And so the teacher prep programs have had to come along to shift the types of things that they're teaching teachers in pre-service and what they're showing them how to do. When we're funding a state system, it means that we should be aligned to what the state's needs or the regional needs are, and to make sure that the practical skills being learned will be either quickly adopted to work context of a school that they're going to be positioned in as a licensed educator, and or directly applicable.
When preparation and practice aren't aligned, the outcome doesn't change. It becomes predictable. This is the shift from ignorance to negligence. Upstream lever. The responsibility doesn't stop with teachers. It moves upstream to the institutions preparing them. Here's how Professor Dr. Carolyn Carlson at Washburn University describes what responsible preparation can look like.
The evolving knowledge really does create this professional imperative. As we are conducting research, we are learning about new research, we translate that into what we are teaching. And so coursework, materials, information is constantly being updated and revised, and we're looking at new ways to do things.
Some universities are beginning to change, but change without accountability remains uneven. In Kansas, the Blueprint for Literacy outlines what teacher preparation should include, but guidance alone isn't enough. Without accountability, implementation remains uneven.
But again, even if it's all theory and philosophy, the teachers aren't going to have the tools to put that theory and philosophy into the classroom.
And when implementation is optional, outcomes are too. Teachers care deeply about their students, but speaking openly about what's missing can carry risks.
That conversation is hard sometimes because it's really hard to hear that you've been doing something wrong. But I need teachers to know, it's not their fault that they were prepared incorrectly, because we're not holding the systems that are designed to support them accountable.
Hi, I'm Katie O'Donnell, a teacher who works with students who struggle to read every day. If you've ever wondered what dyslexia really is, or how to talk about it with your child's school, you're not alone, and you don't have to figure it out by yourself. That's why Janine Phillips hosts a free monthly conversation called Dyslexia, Let's Talk About It. It's a Dyslexia 101 workshop for parents, educators, and allies who want clarity, confidence, and a place to ask real questions. We meet every third Thursday of the month, online and in person at Phillips Fundamental Learning Center, because advocacy starts with understanding, and we're stronger when we learn together. To RSVP, call 316-684-7323. We look forward to hearing from you.
When systems fail to prepare teachers, that failure doesn't stay contained. It gets passed on. When proof exists and children are still not being taught to read, responsibility moves upstream. So the next question becomes, who controls the system that decides how teachers are trained? Thanks for listening to My Child Can't Read, a Heartland Crisis. If this episode resonated with you, if you saw your child, your classroom, or your community in these stories, you're not alone. Now is the time to act. Every child can learn to read, and we all share responsibility to make it happen. I invite you to take action today by subscribing to catch every episode, rating and reviewing to help others find this series, sharing your story and learning how the Phillips Fundamental Learning Center is changing lives at funlearn.org/podcast, and by sharing this show with a friend, teacher, or parent who needs to hear it. All resources, source credits, and tools mentioned in this episode can be found in the show notes. Together, we can take responsibility and rewrite the story of literacy. One child, one classroom, and one school at a time right here in the Heartland.